Welcome to Fierce Queen's Reckoning. I'm so glad you're here. Now let's get into the story. The real estate developer parked his leased Porsche Cayenne in front of a sagging Victorian on a dead-end street in Hamilton's North End. Armed with a lowball offer worth less than the land it sat on, and a 26-year-old girlfriend draped in Flatiron Market finds she'd convinced herself were vintage. He had driven 2 hours from Toronto to watch his ex-wife crumble. He wanted to buy the house back for pennies, dangle the check in her face, and let Tiana see exactly how far Sylvia had fallen since the divorce. What he didn't know, what neither of them had any way of knowing, was that the moment they stepped through that warped front gate, they had walked directly into the most expensive mistake of Brandon Holt's professional life. And the quiet, unhurried woman who answered the door had been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for precisely this afternoon. Chapter 1. The Condescension Tour. When 48-year-old Brandon Holt pulled up to 14 Wendover Crescent, he did not get out of the car immediately. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting the engine idle, letting Tiana take in the full, unfiltered spectacle of the property from the passenger seat. The roof along the east side dipped visibly. 2 of the porch spindles were missing, leaving gaps like broken teeth. The paint, a color that had once been sage green and now resembled something closer to exhaustion, was peeling in wide strips, curling away from the clapboard siding like old skin. Brandon reached over and squeezed Tiana's knee with the satisfied energy of a man who has just confirmed a deeply held belief about himself. "This is it," he said. Tiana pressed her nose briefly against the window, the way a child does when looking into an aquarium. "It's worse than you described," she said. Not unkindly, just factually. She had the particular unsentimental directness of someone who had never personally invested in anything they couldn't return. Brandon climbed out, straightening his quarter-zip pullover, Lululemon, fitted, chosen specifically for days when he needed to look successful without appearing to try. He had a lean, well-maintained build, the kind that signals gym membership more than physical labor. His hair had gone a distinguished gray at the temples, which he had been told repeatedly suited him. He believed this without question. "She's going to be grateful," he said, more to himself than to Tiana. "She has no idea what to do with this place." She never did. Tiana climbed out of the passenger side without waiting for him to come around, which he didn't notice. Her boots were block-heeled, her jacket a cropped sherpa that stopped above the waist, leaving a strip of midriff visible in the October air. She shivered once, immediately, and then squared her jaw and refused to do it again. "Just don't let her make it weird," Tiana said. "She's the type." Brandon didn't answer. He was already walking toward the gate. 10 years ago, Brandon and Sylvia Marchetti had bought this house together, gutted it together, and run out of money together before the renovation was anywhere near complete. They had been 2 people who wanted the same things in entirely incompatible ways. Sylvia was a structural engineer. She thought in load-bearing walls, in foundational integrity, in what a thing could eventually become. Brandon thought in comparable sales, in neighborhood comps, in what a thing could be flipped for before the market shifted. They had met in a graduate program in civil engineering at McMaster and, for a few years, the difference between them had felt like balance. Then the company came. Brandon had founded Holt Urban Properties with seed money from Sylvia's family connections and the credibility her professional reputation lent to the early investor meetings. By the time the company was pulling in 7 figures in annual revenue, Brandon had decided that Sylvia, careful, methodical, disinclined to perform ambition at networking events, was not an asset to the lifestyle he was building. She was a liability. The divorce had been engineered to be quick. His lawyers were expensive. Hers, at the time, was a single practitioner in Oakville she had found through a friend. Brandon had walked away with the company, the Rosedale townhouse, and the liquidity. Sylvia had walked away with a modest settlement, a few personal accounts, and the deed to this unfinished Victorian in Hamilton that no one else had wanted. A property that, at the time of the split, had been assessed at just under $200,000. Brandon had expected her to sell it within a year, to move somewhere smaller, to simplify. Instead, she had gone completely quiet. No social media, no updates through mutual connections, no calls asking for anything. Just silence, the kind that Brandon had initially read as defeat and had stopped thinking about entirely within 18 months. Today was the first time he'd thought about her in nearly 3 years. And the only reason he was thinking about her now was that Holt Urban Properties needed this particular lot. The city of Hamilton had just approved a heritage corridor development plan that made the entire North End block, including 14 Wendover Crescent, worth several times what it had been at the time of the divorce. His development partner, a Vancouver-based firm called Crestline Build Group, had flagged the parcel specifically. The neighboring lots had already been quietly acquired. This one was the last piece. It would be easy, Brandon had told himself. She'd probably be relieved. He'd offer her $350, maybe $400. Generous by any reasonable standard, given the state of the building. She'd sign. They'd be done. He pushed through the front gate. The hinge squealed. He climbed the 3 steps to the porch, noting the soft give under his right foot. Tiana picked her way up behind him. He knocked. For a long moment, nothing. Tiana exhaled loudly through her nose. Then the deadbolt turned, and the door opened. And Sylvia Marchetti stood in the threshold. Brandon had not prepared himself for how she would look. He had, without consciously deciding to, assumed she would look diminished. He had imagined the vague, generalized deterioration of someone whose life had contracted. Tiredness around the eyes, a softness in the posture, the particular deflation of a person who has been treading water for years. Sylvia Marchetti looked like none of those things. She was 41, and she wore it the way some women wear tailored blazers, with an ease that comes not from effort, but from having stopped apologizing for existing. Her hair was dark and pulled back simply. She was dressed in a paint-flecked canvas work shirt, over a cream thermal, work trousers, and a pair of worn steel-toed boots that had clearly spent significant time on actual job sites. There was no performance in her appearance. No armor assembled for the occasion. She looked like a woman who had been interrupted from something she was genuinely busy doing. She looked at Brandon first, a single, even breath. Then her dark eyes moved to Tiana, taking a slow, unhurried inventory. The Sherpa crop, the block heels, the cold-stiffened midriff, and returned to Brandon's face. "Brandon," Sylvia said. Her voice was low, measured, the voice of someone who has learned, through long practice, not to give away information before they need to. "Sylvia," Brandon said, and smiled the smile he used at investor presentation. "You look well. You look like you drove here from somewhere more comfortable," she said, not unkindly. She glanced at his quarter zip. "Come in." Chapter 2. The Fortress. Brandon stepped inside, Tiana close behind him, and he was already composing, in his head, the apologetic but firm language he would use to make the offer. He was prepared for mess. He was prepared for half-finished drywall, exposed wiring, contractor-grade everything. He had walked through 100 distressed properties in his career. He knew the smell of stalled renovation, damp plaster, wood rot, the low-grade defeat of deferred maintenance. The entryway of 14 Wendover Crescent smelled of cedar and turpentine, and very faintly, of something expensive being cooked. The hallway was narrow and deliberately preserved. Original wainscoting, carefully restored, the wood oiled to a deep honey tone. The floor underfoot was reclaimed heart pine, wide plank fitted so tightly the seams were nearly invisible. An antique brass pendulum clock ticked softly against the left wall, its face polished, its pendulum moving with the quiet authority of something that had been properly maintained for a very long time. Brandon slowed. "Mind the step?" Sylvia said, gesturing toward the transition from hallway to main room, where the flooring shifted and rose by 2 inches into what had been, in the original Victorian layout, the formal parlor. They stepped up. Brandon stopped walking. The back of the house had been structurally opened. A substantial, technically complex renovation that had removed 2 non-load-bearing interior walls and replaced them with exposed Douglas fir beams, rough sawn and sealed, that spanned the full width of the space. The original exterior brick, cleaned and repointed, formed the north wall. Against it hung a single enormous painting. Not a print, not a reproduction, but an original canvas, oil on linen, dense with layered color, the kind of work that commanded attention, not by being loud but by being completely, undeniably present. The ceiling in this room was 12 feet, with the original plaster medallion restored at its center, from which hung a custom iron chandelier. Hand-forged, not manufactured, with the slightly irregular elegance of something made by someone who understood craft. The kitchen, visible beyond a low island of honed black soapstone, was a working kitchen, not a showroom. Copper-bottom pots hung from a pot rack overhead. A 6-burner commercial range, a Lacanche, French, the kind professional chef retired to their homes, occupied the far wall. The countertops were the same black soapstone as the island, warm and matte, with the small natural variations that told you immediately they were real. At the island, a cast-iron Dutch oven sat on a trivet, its lid slightly ajar. The smell coming from it was the source of the expensive cooking scent, Something slow, braised, herbaceous, hours in the making. Through the rear of the kitchen, through a pair of tall casement windows, Brandon could see the yard. It had been transformed into a structured garden, raised cedar beds, stone paths, an espaliered apple tree trained flat against the south-facing fence. In the far corner, a glass and steel workshop addition, properly permitted, clearly engineered, housed what appeared to be a full technical drafting studio. The light inside it was on. Tiana had gone very quiet beside him. She was looking at the painting on the brick wall, then at the chandelier, then at her own Sherpa jacket, which she pulled slightly closed across her midriff with one hand. Brandon was performing a rapid, involuntary reassessment. The scope of this renovation was not the work of a woman treading water. This was not a distressed property. He ran the numbers fast, the way he always did, the reflex of 20 years in development. This was a property that, even before the Heritage Corridor announcement, would have appraised well above $800,000, probably closer to $1 million too, given the quality of the finishes and the custom workshop addition in the rear. With the Heritage Corridor designation and the development interest from Crestline, this address was now worth between $2 and $3 million. Brandon had come to offer her $400,000. "Can I get either of you something?" Sylvia asked, moving behind the island with the unhurried ease of a person entirely comfortable in her own space. "I have coffee on. There's tea." "Nothing for me," Brandon said, a beat too quickly. Tiana said nothing. Brandon cleared his throat. He needed to recalibrate. He set his shoulders, anchored himself back in the posture of a man who owned a company and said, "Sylvia, I'll get to the point. I'm not here to waste your time. You drove 2 hours." Sylvia said pleasantly, filling a ceramic mug for herself. "I assumed you wanted something." "I want to make you an offer on the property," Brandon said. Sylvia looked up from her coffee. Her expression didn't change. "All right," she said. "What's the offer?" Brandon had, on the drive down, planned to open at $350. He had revised that up to $400 while sitting in the car. He was now, standing in this kitchen, acutely aware that $400,000 was so far below the actual value of what he was standing in, that naming the number out loud would tell Sylvia exactly how little he had understood about her life for the past 5 years. He said it anyway. $450, he said. "That's a significant premium over current assessed value." Silence. Tiana looked at her boots. Sylvia took a sip of her coffee, looking at Brandon over the rim of her mug with an expression he could not quite read. It was not anger. It was not surprise. It was closer to the look a very experienced professor gives a student who has written down the right formula and arrived at the completely wrong answer. "Brandon," Sylvia said quietly, setting her mug down on the soapstone. "Why are you actually here?" Chapter 3. The Architecture of a Trap. "I told you," Brandon said. "I want to buy the property." "You want the lot," Sylvia said. Brandon blinked. "Holt Urban Properties acquired the parcels on either side of this address in the last 8 months. Sylvia continued, in the same unhurried tone. "Lot 12, purchased in February through a numbered corporation registered to your development partner in Vancouver. Lot 16, purchased in June through a separate holding company." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm a structural engineer, Brandon. I've spent my entire career reading site plans. I know what an assembled land parcel looks like." The silence in the kitchen was total. Tiana had stopped looking at her boots. "The Heritage Corridor designation," Sylvia said, "makes this block exceptionally valuable for a mid-density residential project with ground-floor retail. The City of Hamilton's planning approval, which went to public committee in August, would allow a 6-story mixed-use development on an assembled lot of sufficient size." She paused. "This property is the keystone. Without it, your assembled parcel doesn't meet the minimum frontage requirement for the development permit." Brandon's jaw tightened. "Where are you getting this information?" "Planning committee meetings are public record," Sylvia said. "I've been attending them for 2 years." The tightness spread from Brandon's jaw up behind his eyes. He pressed 2 fingers to his temple and recalibrated again. Faster this time. "Fine," he said. "You know the situation. Then you know the offer I'm making is reasonable given what you paid for this." "What I paid for this 4 years ago," Sylvia said, "is not relevant to what it's worth today." "Name your number," Brandon said. He was using his negotiation voice now, low, steady, controlled. "I'm prepared to be flexible." Sylvia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm not selling." Brandon laughed, not from amusement, from the particular reflex of a man who has confused confidence with inevitability. "Sylvia, be reasonable. You're sitting on a property that—" I'm aware of what I'm sitting on, she said. I've been aware of it for 2 years. Something in her tone, the specific flatness of it, the absence of negotiating energy, the way she said it like she was reporting a fact rather than staking out a position, made Brandon go still. You've known about the Heritage Corridor for 2 years, he said slowly. Since before it went to public committee, she said. How? Sylvia looked at him steadily. Because I'm the engineer of record on the preliminary feasibility study that informed the city's planning decision, she said. Brandon stared at her. I've been consulting for the Hamilton Planning Department for 3 years, Sylvia continued. Her voice quiet, factual, the voice she used in technical briefings. I was part of the working group that identified the Wendover block as a Heritage Corridor anchor site. I helped write the heritage designation criteria that now apply to this address. A pause. I own the keystone parcel of the most strategically valuable development block in the lower city, Brandon. And I have been sitting on it, very quietly, since the day you handed me the deed and told me it was worth nothing. The room was extraordinarily still. Tiana sat down on a counter stool without being invited, as if her legs had simply made a decision without consulting her. You engineered this, Brandon said. His voice came out smaller than he intended. I didn't engineer anything, Sylvia said. I did my job extremely well, in a field you never took seriously, and I paid attention to the implications of my own work. She lifted her coffee mug. The engineering was already there. I just understood what it meant. Brandon's mind was running hard now, stripping back through 4 years of assumptions, looking for the moments he had misread. He found approximately 3 dozen of them in under a minute. All right, he said. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. The table was reclaimed oak, solid, clearly made by hand, and sat down. He had learned over 2 decades of deal-making that the moment you sat down instead of standing, you were negotiating rather than dictating. He sat down. What do you want for it? I told you, Sylvia said pleasantly. I'm not selling. Everyone sells at the right number, Brandon said. That's a thing people say when they can't imagine wanting something other than money, Sylvia replied. She pulled a stool out on her side of the island and sat across from, her work-booted feet resting on the low rung of the stool, entirely at ease. I want to build here. You want to? I've submitted a development application, Sylvia said, under Marchetti Structural Design, Inc. I've partnered with a firm out of Montreal, Delacroix Urban Studio. We're proposing a 7-story mixed-use building on an assembled lot. She reached into a flat portfolio folder that had been sitting on the end of the kitchen island and withdrew a single printed page, a site plan, clean and detailed, with the parcel highlighted in the center. She slid it across the soapstone toward him. Brandon looked down at the page. The assembled parcel was larger than his, significantly larger. You've acquired the lots on the other side, he said. Lot 18 and 20, Sylvia said. Both purchased last spring, well before your numbered corporation started moving on the north end. Brandon looked up from the site plan. His face had gone through several configurations in the last 3 minutes and had arrived, finally, at something that was simply bare, stripped of the smooth transactional confidence he wore as a professional skin. You've already submitted, he said. Filed in September, she said. Pre-consultation with planning was positive. The heritage designation actually helps my application, given that my proposal includes adaptive reuse of the Victorian facade and a community heritage component on the ground floor. She paused. The city likes it a great deal, Sylvia. Brandon set his hands flat on the table. If your application goes through, my parcels on either side are stranded. I can't develop them independently. They don't meet the minimum lot size. No, Sylvia agreed. They don't. Brandon stared at her. Then very slowly he said, You're going to offer to buy them from me. Sylvia looked at him with the same expression she had worn since the moment she opened the door. Calm, present, fractionally ahead of wherever he thought the conversation was. I'm going to offer you market rate, she said, as assessed today, not 4 years ago. From the pocket of her work trousers, Sylvia drew her phone. She opened an email and set it on the soapstone between them. It was from Etienne Delacroix, principal at Delacroix Urban Studio, dated that morning. The subject line read, Marchetti. Confirmed financing and pre-approval. The body of the email was brief. Project financing confirmed at $11.2 million through BDC and Montreal Trust. Construction pre-approval proceeding as planned. Looking forward to the groundbreaking. Brandon read the email once. Then again. $11.2 million, fully financed, pre-approved, already moving. He had come to Hamilton, to offer his ex-wife $450,000 for a property she had been quietly converting for 4 years into the keystone of a development project worth an order of magnitude more. He sat very still. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. Tiana broke the silence. She had been on the counterstool this entire time with the alert, watchful expression of someone who is very quickly recalibrating which person in the room has the money. 11 million, she said. Roughly, Sylvia said. Total project cost, including land. That's the... Tiana looked at Brandon. That's more than... She stopped. Looked at the site plan on the island. Looked at Brandon's hands flat on the reclaimed oak table. Brandon, how much is the Porsche payment every month? Tiana, Brandon said. I'm just asking, Tiana said. She turned back to Sylvia. Is the Montreal firm? Are they the main partner, or... Tiana. Brandon's voice came out hard and ragged. The negotiator's composure was gone. What was underneath it was not anger, exactly. It was something more destabilizing than anger. It was the specific, airless feeling of a person who has just realized that the story they have been living inside, the story in which they are the architect and everyone else is the material, is not the story that has actually been happening. He turned back to Sylvia. Why didn't you fight back? He said. During the divorce, you signed everything. You let my lawyers walk you through the whole process, and you barely pushed back on anything. Why? Sylvia looked at him for a moment. Because your lawyers were very good at protecting the assets I didn't want, she said. Brandon blinked. You were so focused on keeping the company and the Rosedale townhouse, she said, that neither you nor your lawyers spent any serious time on the deed to a deteriorating Victorian in Hamilton that the original assessment valued at $180,000. She paused. I signed what your lawyers put in front of me, because what your lawyers put in front of me was exactly what I wanted to leave with. The copper-bottom pots overhead caught the afternoon light. The Dutch oven on the trivet exhaled a small breath of fragrant steam. The pendulum clock in the hallway continued its quiet, indifferent accounting of seconds. You planned this before the divorce, Brandon said. I had done the preliminary site analysis on the Wendover block before we even separated, Sylvia said. I knew what the North End was going to look like in 5 to 8 years. I knew this address was the anchor. I wanted it, so I made sure I got it. Brandon pressed a knuckle briefly to his mouth, looked at the table, looked up. The consulting work with the city, he said. When did you start that? 3 months after the divorce was finalized, she said. He let out a slow breath through his nose. It came out unsteadily. And Delacroix, how long have you been in conversation with Delacroix? We met at a conference in Ottawa 2.5 years ago, she said. We've been working on this project formally for 18 months. Brandon sat with that. The timeline arranged itself in his head with a terrible clarifying neatness. While he had been in Rosedale, closing deals, leasing the Porsche, choosing the quarter zip, acquiring the flanking lots through numbered corporations he had assumed were discreet. Sylvia had been here, in this house, restoring it board by board and beam by beam, attending planning committee meetings, building a Montreal partnership, and filing a development application that made every move he had made in the North End not merely redundant but potentially a liability. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It was Derek Pham, his operations director at Holt Urban Properties. He put it face down on the table. It buzzed again. He turned it over. Derek again, now a call. He picked it up. Derek, I'm in the middle of something. Brandon. Derek's voice was clipped. The tone he used when the thing he was about to say was something he had been hoping not to have to say. Are you in Hamilton right now? Are you with Sylvia Marchetti? Brandon's eyes moved to Sylvia's face. She was watching him with the mild, interested attention of someone watching a weather system develop from a comfortable distance. Yes, Brandon said carefully. Her application went to expedited review this morning, Derek said. Planning approved the Marchetti Delacroix proposal at 11:15. It went through on the Heritage Corridor fast track. The city's issuing a design approval notice today. A pause. Brandon, the notice officially designates 14 Wendover and the flanking parcels she's assembled as the primary development envelope. Our lots are outside the design boundary. Another pause. We're not in the approved footprint. Brandon said nothing. Our parcels don't have standalone development rights under the new corridor bylaw, Derek said. We either sell to someone with a conforming application. Basically, we sell to her, or we sit on parcels we can't develop, potentially for years, while the block gets built up around us. A very long pause. I just want to make sure you understood that before you said anything to her. The line went quiet. Brandon looked at the email on the soapstone. The 11.2 million. The pre-approval. The groundbreaking. Thank you, Derek, he said. He placed the phone very carefully on the table, face down again. Tiana was looking at him with an expression that had moved through several intermediate stages and arrived at something she was clearly trying not to show. Brandon turned to Sylvia. I need to sell you the flanking parcels, he said. His voice was flat and entirely without performance. The words had the quality of a structural confession, something load-bearing that had finally, after too long, been said aloud. Yes, Sylvia said. You do. What will you offer? Current assessed value, she said. As I said. Which, given the Heritage Corridor designation that went into effect this morning, is substantially higher than what you paid. You'll make money on the transaction. She paused. Not the money you came here expecting, but money. Brandon looked at the side plan. The two stranded parcels sat on either side of Sylvia's footprint like brackets, useful only in relation to the thing at the center. He had acquired them to surround her. They had ended up framing her. My development partner in Vancouver, he said. Crestline. They have equity in those acquisitions. I know, Sylvia said. I've already spoken with their principal. She took a measured sip of her coffee. Crestline called my office 3 weeks ago. Once the planning pre-approval leaked internally, their team did the site analysis and realized what the boundary designation would mean for your parcels. She held his gaze. They're not your partner anymore, Brandon. They asked to be introduced to Etienne Delacroix. The introduction has been made. Chapter 5. What was always hers. Brandon sat at Sylvia's reclaimed oak table for a long time after that. Tiana had gone quiet in the way that meant she was making internal calculations. At a certain point, she stood up from the counter stool and walked, uninvited, further into the living space, looking at the painting on the brick wall with a new, assessing attention. She pulled out her phone and took a photo of the artist's signature in the lower right corner. Brandon watched her do this. He said nothing. Sylvia poured herself a second coffee and leaned against the counter. You told me at the mediation, Brandon said finally, his voice low and stripped of everything except the words themselves, that I was better off without a partner who thought in decades instead of quarters. He looked at the table. That was me. I said that to you. You did, Sylvia said. I meant it as an insult. I know, she said. I accepted it as a compliment and went home and got to work. Brandon looked up at her. In his face, behind the residue of a very difficult hour, there was something that had not been there when he walked in. Something that was not quite admiration, and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. The look of a person who has just fully understood something they spent years deliberately not seeing. He didn't apologize. Sylvia had not been waiting for an apology. She had understood a long time ago that the only apology worth anything in this kind of situation was the one written in years of work and patience and the absolute refusal to be smaller than you were. I need the purchase agreement for the parcels in writing, he said. I'll have my lawyer. My solicitor will send the offer to your firm's legal address by end of day tomorrow, Sylvia said. Standard commercial conveyance terms. It's straightforward. Brandon pushed his chair back from the table. He stood, and he looked suddenly and entirely unremarkably like a man of 48 who had made a 2-hour drive in October for a conversation that had not gone in any direction he had planned. Tiana reappeared from the living room, phone in hand. She looked at Brandon. Ready? She said. Yes, Brandon said. He picked up his car keys from where he'd set them on the soapstone. He looked at them in his hand for a moment. The Porsche crest on the fob, the particular gleam of least confidence. He set them back down, zipped his quarter zip to the collar, picked the keys up again, and walked toward the hallway. At the threshold to the entryway, he stopped. He didn't turn around. He stood for a moment with his back to the kitchen, to the Douglas fir beams and the LaCanche range and the light from the workshop in the rear yard. Then he walked down the restored heart pine hallway, opened the front door with its quiet, well-oiled hinges, and stepped out onto the porch. The door closed behind him with a solid, unhurried sound, the sound of a well-fitted door in a well-made house, closing completely. Sylvia stood in her kitchen and listened until she heard the gate, and then the car, and then nothing. She turned back to the stove. She lifted the lid from the Dutch oven, releasing a long curl of fragrant steam into the kitchen air. Braised short rib, celery root, a bay leaf, red wine from a bottle she had opened 2 nights ago because it was Tuesday and she had wanted it. She replaced the lid, reduced the flame slightly, and set the timer. She walked through the living room and through the rear casement door into the garden. stepping down onto the stone path that ran between the raised cedar beds toward the workshop. She switched on the drafting light over the tilted board, where the revised site drawings had been pinned for 3 days. She picked up her mechanical pencil, the heritage corridor plan spread out before her. The whole of it, the assembled parcels, the 7-story elevation she and Etienne had worked over in 6 revisions, the ground floor heritage rooms, the residential floors above. Her pencil moved to the lot boundary line where Brandon's 2 parcels sat. She drew a clean bracket. In 2 weeks, those parcels would be hers. She made a small notation in the margin, a measurement, a dimension, and stood back, holding her pencil loosely at her side, looking at the plan the way she had always looked at structures, not as finished things, but as living systems in the process of becoming exactly what they were designed to be. Outside, the October air had gone cool and clear. The espaliered apple tree against the south fence held its last few leaves, paper-thin and amber, trembling slightly in a wind that smelled of wood smoke, and the particular mineral sharpness of a Canadian autumn settling into itself. Sylvia turned off the drafting light and walked back to the house. The short rib needed another 40 minutes. She had a full evening ahead of her, and the work was good, and the house was hers, and she had not once, in 4 years, doubted that it was going to end exactly like this.